everyone to panel 3 of this conference. I think we've had a fantastic day yesterday, and we've been extremely privileged to listen to the President of Afghanistan, Dr. Ashraf Ghani, addressing us as an academic community directly with some extremely rich recommendations and analysis and ideas that have been really focus of his time over the last few years. In this panel, we will be discussing the possibilities of a future governance order in Afghanistan, including the potential for a negotiated political settlement between the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the Taliban. To do so, we have with us yet another extremely distinguished group of academic experts who have been leading the forefront of scholarship in this field for over 20 years. We have colleagues joining us from various parts of the world, including from Australia, where I'm very conscious of the fact that it is pushing towards midnight down there, but we will try our best to stick to the timetable as much as possible. Allow me to remind everyone that although we will be giving each speaker 10 minutes only to present the key aspects of his or her paper, the actual papers and the research presented at this panel, like with the previous panels, will be eventually published in an edited volume by the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. I will introduce each of the 5 speakers, and we have 5 speakers over an hour and 10 minutes now. I will be introducing each of them as they speak. And at the end, we will still have at least 30 minutes for a question and answer session. For the question and answers, if you are one of our panelists, or if you have registered into the Zoom link, all you need to do is to leave your question in the question answer or discussion function. If you're following us on social media, please write your question directly on whatever social media you follow, and my colleagues will make sure that I am getting it here. You can write in whatever language you wish. As we said at the beginning of this session, when we introduced the president, this conference is being broadcast in 4 languages, Pashto, Dari, English, and Arabic. And there are channels for each of those languages. You can also write your questions in whatever language you wish, and my colleagues will translate it into English, and we will be able to address it to the right member of the panel. Alternatively, if you'd like to simply email your question, then please do email it to events@arabcenterdc.org, and we will be getting that. Our first speaker for this session is Sheikh Mazar Raheem Saleh. Sheikh Mazar Raheem Saleh is listed on our publicity material as an independent researcher. He was a founding member of the Taliban Political Commission between 2012 and 2020, and was based in Doha for most of his time. He was previously a lecturer at the International Islamic University in Islamabad between 2010 and 2011, and before that at Al-Qasimi University in Pakistan between 2009 and 2012. He holds a degree in Islamic Studies from the International Islamic University in Islamabad, where he also completed his PhD in 2011, and before that an MPhil in 2006, and a Bachelor of Islamic Studies in 2004. He has also obtained a bachelor degree in Arabic language and Sharia law from Peshawar College in 1997. Sheikh Mazar has been instrumental in devising quite a bit of the policy of the Taliban and the analysis of the Taliban movement during the years when he served in the commission in Doha. And we're very, very grateful and honored that he has been able to find the time to share some of his thoughts with us today. In his paper, he will shed some light on the actual ideology of governance from a Taliban perspective. As a religious movement that seeks to implement Islamic law in the form of the Islamic Emirate to better the situation in Afghanistan. Of course, I must emphasize that at this moment, Sheikh Saleh does not speak on behalf of the movement. He has left the commission office, and he is engaging with us purely as a scholar who is reflecting based on his experience, his studies, his research on the various aspects of the movement. The movement seeks in its own mind to establish a state on the platform of the rightly guided caliphate, in which absolute sovereignty is the sole right of God and relative sovereignty is delegated to the nation within the limitations of the Sharia. Hence, there is a very big difference between it and what the Islamic Republic side sees the issue, or how it sees the issue of sovereignty. To help us understand this better and to reflect more in an in-depth discourse, I would like to welcome Sheikh Saleh. Sheikh Saleh will speak at the beginning. I think he will make just a short introduction in English, and then he will be speaking in Pashto. So again, if you need the translation English, you go to on the Zoom link to English, Arabic to Spanish, and Dari, you need to go to Chinese. And thank you very much. Dr. Saleh, over to you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. تسمعني؟ Can you cover me?
نعم، تفضل.
الحمد لله وكفى والصلاة والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد. First of all, I would like to extend my greetings and wishes to all the participants. I'm very pleased today to find myself among the professors and academics here in conference. As an Afghan, I appreciate all of your efforts in this regard. I also thank to Professor Sultan Barakat, Director of the Center of Complex and Humanitarians here in Doha, and Excellency Dr. Khalil Jahshan, Executive Director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., who have organized this conference and gave me this valuable opportunity. So thank you, all of you. As Dr. Sultan Barakat said, one thing should be clear here, that I'm not representing any side here. I'm just participating as an academic and sharing my experience through this pulpit. My points about the Taliban or the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan are just guesswork, experience, and personal perspective, no formal position. Unfortunately, there is translation, so let me now go to my own language, Pashto, to present my paper. So thank you very much.
My topic has 14 points, and I will share one, if Allah wills, taking time into consideration. The first is the current system of Afghanistan is problems, the central system of Afghanistan, the Taliban system that they want. Number 3, Taliban and the current constitution. Number 4, the constitution and what are the issues in the constitution that the Taliban do not accept. Number 5, what kind of a system Taliban want. What sort of a system, the selection of the leader of the faithful. Number 7, the term emirate and the Council of Aqd, and number 9, the issue of election and the vision of Taliban. Number 10, in the security sector, the reintegration of the fighters and what Taliban will do. In number 11, Taliban and reconciliation, national reconciliation. Number 12, Taliban and prosecution and others, and also Taliban's view about the political parties. And at the end, if I had time, I will talk about, I will share a few points with regards to Taliban. So I'll come to first point. The first point is the current system of Afghanistan and what are the main problems it has. We are looking at this because in the future, whoever will want to rule in Afghanistan in the future, And if they will want to do it by themselves or will do it in partnership with the others, it's very important that they have a program to solve them right away. Because if they will not take into consideration, their future will be just the same the way it is of the current government. Now I'll come to this. In 2001, when the Islamic Emirate or Taliban's government, by the direct invasion of US and NATO, failed, and then the different groups came together in Bonn, Germany, to discuss and decide about the future government of Afghanistan. A lot of Afghans, particularly the political analysts, were saying that seems like the fight will be over in Afghanistan, and it is that a democratic government will be introduced into Afghanistan. But at the end of the Bonn conference in 2001, the agreement that they reached, and at the same time, the experts shared the concern that it was against the expectation, and that the America did not have noble intention towards Afghanistan, because one side intentionally, that was of Taliban and Hikmat, are kept out of these decisions. And on the other side, those hated personalities, those warlords that people really hated, were once again made to rule over the people of Afghanistan. So that was the reason. Because of this ill agreement, the current government was introduced. Billions of dollars were spent. It had a lot of privileges. But day after another, we witnessed that it had problems locally, internationally, and now it is in such a bad shape that you cannot even count on it to be able to rule properly. So I will refer to the problems that the current government is having. Number one, security. The issue of insecurity is the biggest problem that the government is facing. The government is not able to provide security to the people for their wealth, for their life, keeping the armed opposition of Taliban on one side, but look at the abductors, look at the land grabbers, look at the warlords, and against all of these, the government has failed. The public properties are being grabbed, usurped by the and traders, and also people are not people are not able to go to their jobs, and uh, these were all the reasons why that people are taking out their property out of Afghanistan. They are leaving Afghanistan. That is one big challenge, and that is of insecurity. The other is political instability. The fact that because of the lack of security, the other problem that the current government is having is the political instability. People are not obedient. People do not show obedience, and that's the reason why the government, the system is facing local and international challenges. If we talk about the political instability, every political party just look at their own interest, and uh, there is no coordination, and on bigger matters of national interest, the government has not been able to create a coordination among the political parties. We see a clear example in the last two rounds of elections. For instance, the weak national unity government and the current political setup, whatever decision the government is making is turning into a big problem and chaos. And at the same time, problems between the government and the parliament are the big reasons for the political instability. The other example is that there is opposition between the political parties, and they still have not been able to create a political consensus and get people united. And the other big problem is corruption and bribery. If you look at the different positions, if you want to go to the parliament, if you want to serve as one of the government employee, you have to pay big bribe. And it's not only the local people, it's the international organizations that are also referring to. We see that the bribery is so widespread, and it's impossible to tackle it. Number four, social justice. Social justice does not exist. This is one of the important responsibilities. This is the legal responsibility of any governments to ensure social justice. But if we see the current system, uh, there is no social justice. The ones who have power can do anything. They can break the law. They can even violate the constitution. They can steal the public properties. They are not prosecuted. But if a common citizen does any of such things, then the government is so tough on the implementation of the law on them. And at the same time, the government positions are only given to people based on their relations, not based on their merit. During the recruitment, no standard merit are taken into consideration. Uh, we know for the last many years, we see people are being changed from one position to another position, and there are already so many other talented people who do not get these jobs. Uh, and uh, we can see the examples. For example, how did they reach this agreement? There was no such thing in the constitution identified for the sort of an agreement they reached and created the government. And again, we see that the government positions are being distributed. People are being given big names and honorary medals. They are all against the constitution. And number six, we have armed groups inside the government. There are armed groups who are a threat against the government in Panjshir, Kaisari, Alipur. These are individuals, armed individuals who are against the government, and the government cannot disarm them. And at the tribal level, again, we see that the security system is actually based on the tribal system. That's the reason why this defense sector is not a national sector. It's only tribalistic. It's only interested. It's only interested in its own tribal affiliations. And at the same time, from the very beginning, between the security sector, the Afghanistan National Army was actually based on certain tribal inclination, and every tribe was trying to strengthen their position. So instead for it to be a national thing and for people to benefit from it, unfortunately the recruitment is actually based on political parties, and you cannot see it to be national. And the other thing is the weak management. And all these are the reasons why we have a weak government. And this was an American plan, that the government was divided into the different tribes. It was not strengthened, and everyone had a share, who would be minister, who would be the parliamentarian, who would be the head. So, and they only are loyal to the interest of the other countries. They are not loyal to the national interests. These are all the tangible problems to the current government. So what we hope for the future government, whatever government it is, it's very important that it seriously looks into these problems, and right from now have a program in them. Now, talking about the second issue, which was about Taliban asking for a central government. Taliban want a central government. Why do Taliban want a central government? And this is my personal assumption about Afghanistan, that Taliban emphasize on a central system. After the Soviet invasion, it's been 40 years since there's war in Afghanistan, and a lot of material and a lot of moral loss that Afghanistan has suffered. But one of the other big losses is that Afghanistan is divided between the different tribes, and the different invaders, for their ill intentions, had launched this program. So they have been able to divide people based on the language, based on the tribes, and they are utilizing it to divide the people of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a joint home for all the tribes. They all have the right to live under an environment of brotherhood. And that's only possible if you have one strong central government. If you wouldn't have a strong central government, then the enemies from outside and inside of Afghanistan will very easily be able to create hatred among the brothers. And under one or another name, they will put people to fight with one another. If we even see in the recent past, I mean, I look at 1992, 1993, we witnessed at that time, Ostad Rabbani was the ruler, but he only had 7 provinces under his control. All the other parts the islands of power. Marshal Dossum was ruling 6 other provinces. And on the east, there was another person ruling. On south or west, it was Ismail Khan. So the whole country was divided between these commanders. It was like different places had different rulers. Taliban came and Taliban saved Afghanistan from being divided. And then again, the same sort of a situation is felt by Taliban. And they know that to be able to have a united Afghanistan, it's very important that we have a strong central government. So they believe that uh, Afghanistan, for Afghanistan, they believe that a strong system is a strong central system. I don't think if Taliban will accept decentralized system, Taliban will go for the centralized system. My third point is Taliban in the current constitution. Regarding the current constitution, from the very beginning, Taliban had a very specific viewpoint in their official declarations. They have identified the constitution as the law of the time of invasion, although they look at it as the law of the time of invasion. But the main question is if Taliban want to revoke the law or want to bring amendments in the law. From my viewpoint, the current constitution of Afghanistan, as we see it, the current constitution has a lot of good features despite some problems that it has. And we can say that the current constitution of Afghanistan is, I think, better compared to the other countries of the region. So the appropriate thing is, instead of revoking it in full, I think we need to bring amendments in it. And I believe that if we will start the practical work on the constitution of Afghanistan, the Taliban will prefer the amendment than the revoking of the law, because there are certain articles that need to be amended, or we need to clarify them, because certain articles in the constitution look to be against the Sharia of Islam. For example, I will refer to those points that Taliban might find controversial or might not like them. Number one, the fact that the political system in the constitution has been identified as democratic. It has to be based on the democratic principles. Taliban will not accept that because because uh, because Taliban don't think like that. They want, with regards to the political system, they have other preferences, and then I will refer to them in the following points. The other thing is sovereignty is with the people of Afghanistan. What the constitution of Afghanistan identifies, Taliban don't accept it. Taliban believe with regards to the sovereignty, they have their own specific view. And with regards to the human rights declarations, respect to the human rights declaration, all of them are not endorsed by the Taliban because they have their own problems. Now, for one to be able to change your religion is considered to be a natural right. But for blasphemy, Islam has its own right, its own rules. It will not allow for one to be able to leave the religion. And the other thing is, under the Human Rights Declaration, a woman is allowed to take the divorce. But then if you look at the Islamic laws, it is with the man to be able to divorce a woman. So Taliban will have a problem with that article of the constitution as well. Number 4, Article 22 of the constitution that talks about equality between man and a woman. And Taliban as a whole might not accept that, and it might require further details and amendment. Article 33 of the constitution says that even a woman can run for the presidency, but Taliban will not accept that because Taliban do not believe that from the viewpoint of Sharia, for a woman to be able to rule as the president. Of course, a woman can do other things, but they will not accept that. The other thing is, 5th chapter, for a council, there is a definition for the constitution. It is parliament, the House of Representatives, and House of Senate. To my knowledge and how I know the Taliban, they will go for the Aqd Shura, a council which is called Shura of Aqd. And also, if you look at the other part in the constitution, it accepts free market economy. But no, the Taliban will want an Islamic economic system because the free market economy might be based on the interest. And the other thing is about judiciary, the current judiciary and the religious freedom, what the constitution has identified, might not be acceptable for Taliban, and they'll need some in-depth changes and amendment be introduced from the Taliban side. The 5th point, what kind of a system Taliban want? If we look at the Islamic Emirate, if we look at the previous regime of Taliban, if we look at the current facilities, so for the future, we can predict what the kind of a system Taliban will want. there are certain things that are very important at this point and that need to be discussed. The first is to select the leader of the faithful, the issue of election, and as to who can become the member of that council to be able to select the leader of the faithful. Now, that will all be the things that can be discussed under the topic of system. What we understand from what the Taliban are saying is that in most of the Islam, it's the election system that allow for the leader and the representatives to be elected through. So for the welfare, Taliban do not accept this electoral system which the other Islamic countries are following. Taliban will not want for the leader to be selected through the common people. They will want the caliphate, and Taliban have their own reasons. Because of the shortage of time, I will not be able to discuss all the details. And if there were time later, if Allah wills, I can talk about them. The other issue is the selection of the leader of the faithful. Taliban believe that the leader or the president will have to be selected for indefinite time from that Aqd Shura, and he will only be impeached if he, from the physical point of view, is not able to carry out the tasks or commits a blasphemous act. Now, only under those conditions that you can impeach the president. Otherwise, you cannot impeach the president. And it will be a replacement. This Aqd Shura or the Council of Aqd will be a replacement for the parliament. And this will certainly be endorsed by the leader of the faithful. And only those people will be the member of the Aqd Council who are just and who have the political knowledge besides being a Muslim. Now, for the Shura of Ahl al-Hal wa Aqd, I mean, there are different views about that council of Hal wa Aqd. They believe that they have to be believer, they have to be just, they have to be politically informed, and they have to be able to express their views. And with regards to the selection of these members, there is no particular way, and that will be taking the proper context into consideration, and that will be done under an accepted norm. As for Taliban are concerned, this council and the selection of this council, it's only those who have the religious knowledge, and this will be done. They will be appointed by the leader of the faithful. So that's how the Taliban has done it in the past, and that's how the Taliban are going to be doing it in the future.
Saleh, I need you to try and conclude, please, if you may.
Okay. Just me 5 minutes, if you allow me. The انتخابات موضوع تبراشو.
We'll come to the issue of election. So far, we do not have anything clear about this from the Taliban to be able to say if they will accept election, because election they consider to be the reason for the political instability. They have their own reasons, and I'm not going to be able to talk about them from the because of the shortage of time. And at the same time, what are the Taliban's viewpoint on the reintegration of the fighters, Afghanistan, and to be able to end the war? And once the war ends, those fighters who have fought against the Taliban and the invaders will need to return back to their normal life, and the government will think about the reintegration. This is not only what Taliban will want. This is what all will want. But what Taliban want is the sort of a reintegration we want, the sort of the reintegration that the sort of the reintegration Afghanistan government wants, Taliban might not accept. Or what the international community wants, Taliban might not accept. Taliban definitely want the reintegration, but that has to be taking their own conditions into consideration. The war has to completely end. The international forces have to completely withdraw. We have to have an Islamic system, which the Taliban believe is under the light of Sharia. So, because they believe that the presence of the international forces is the reason for the war and for the fight. Unless we have the Islamic system, I don't think that they will reintegrate into the peaceful process. This is not going to be possible. They will not do this. And with this, they say that certain measures have to be taken. Islamic system have to be implemented. There have to be the rule of law, and I just have two more points about Taliban and reconciliation, and my last point is about Taliban and the and prosecution. I can talk about it later. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, respected doctor.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry. I think this is absolutely fascinating. You've offered maybe potentially for the first time some detailed insight into what the doctrine may look like and what are the expectations on. You know, we have been waiting for this for a long time, but the problem is I have other speakers, some of whom are in Australia, and we're way pushed the time for beyond midnight. So with your permission, I just emphasize some of the important points you've raised about the lack of security. Although some people may disagree with you and say, well, all of these issues are just symptoms because of the continuation of war. Had you not gone to war, a lot of these issues would have been resolved. But I'm sure you have a different view of this, and we can come back to it in the discussion. Also, what you believe the Taliban would wish to have in terms of an outcome. I noted carefully the points about the constitution and in particular, I think the role of human rights and women rights and the possibility of a woman becoming a president. Tomorrow, if you are following us for the third day, we will start our day with Her Excellency Fatima Gailani, who was squarely responsible for introducing this item into the Constitution back in 2001. And we'll see if she has changed her mind about it, or if she still thinks it is an important item in the Constitution. But for now, with your permission, I'd like to press ahead and go to our next panelist, who's been waiting with us extremely patiently, Dr. Amin Saikal. Dr. Amin Saikal is the adjunct professor of social science at the University of Western Australia and former distinguished professor of political science, public policy fellow, and the director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at the Australian National University. He is a very well-known academic, and he's written numerous books that I will not have enough time to list all of them. I would just like to highlight some of the key ones that are related to Afghanistan. His book on Afghanistan Spectre, the Security of Central Asia. It's a co-authored book that just come out in 2021. And before that, Iran Rising, the Survival and Future of Islamic Republic by Princeton University in 2019. Islam Beyond Borders by Cambridge Press in 2019, and many, many more books. But I will just stop the introduction at this, Dr. Amin, and turn over to you. I understand from your paper, you already are on a collision track with Sheikh Saleh, and that you are calling for decentralization in Afghanistan, and we are looking forward to hearing your views. Dr. Amin. You need to unmute.
Thank you very much, Professor Barakat, and it's very kind of you to say all those nice words about me. Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and I'm very thankful to Professor Barakat and, of course, the two institutions which have sponsored this important conference. I have to start with a caveat that I couldn't attend yesterday's sessions because by the time the Zoom link arrived, it was a bit too late for me. So I really don't know what has been precisely was covered yesterday. And therefore, there may be some overlap between what I'm about to say and what has already been said, but let's hope not too much. My brief this evening for me, and perhaps this afternoon for you, is to talk about transition and post-governance conflict in Afghanistan. Let me start by saying that Afghanistan faces a critically multifaceted transition and long-term structural instability and insecurity, which really goes against what President Ghani said, and perhaps to some extent may confirm with what Sheikh Saleh has just mentioned. If this transition is not managed effectively, it could result in Afghanistan moving from being a seriously disrupted state to a failed state, threatening its very survival. Many signs currently indicate that the country is galloping towards a wider and deeper conflict with neighboring and regional actors in the saddle to exploit its tragic situation for their contrasting interests. The shape of Afghanistan's future governance will depend on what kind of power and governing structures is likely to consolidate in Kabul, whether these structures will enjoy sufficient support from a cross-section of Afghanistan mosaic population, and whether the regional players will abide by the principle of non-interference. Whatever transpires, the way I see it, both the Afghan leaders and the United States, along with its NATO and non-NATO allies, bear much responsibility for it. I don't want to really go into the history of what has transpired since 2001, and therefore since the start of the US-led intervention in Afghanistan. But I would like to really go straight to the point, and I will cut back my talk as much as I could, that in the wake of the imminent US and allied military exit, the war-torn and COVID-19 ravaged Afghanistan now faces a multifaceted transition. While the United States has found it expedient to make peace with its erstwhile foe, the Taliban, Afghanistan is once again set to embrace a political, economic, and security transformation of the magnitude which will be critical to survival as an effective, indefendable, functioning state. Although the United States and its allies have promised to continue their non-combat support, including funding the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, this should not be taken for granted, as Afghanistan stands to experience more violent and murky times ahead. What form will the country's governance take, and how will the country be governed in the post-US and allied military exit? That's a major question. The response to this question depends on what direction the current conflict will take. Will it be settled in the battlefield or through a negotiated settlement? While it is very risky to make any firm prediction, Afghanistan could follow one of the three directions. The first is that it stays on its present course of conflict for some time, with no substantial change in its chaotic and divided system of governance, provided that the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces remain sufficiently effective and coherent to prevent the Taliban from taking over major cities. This course may last from several months or much longer, especially if the US fulfills its promise to deploy air power in support of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces in their operations, whenever Kabul or perhaps another major city is at risk of being overrun by the opposition forces. Meanwhile, this may compel the Taliban and their Pakistani backers to become more serious about a political settlement. The second direction that Afghanistan could take relates to the possibility of the current government either collapsing or becoming totally ineffective under the weight of a weakening or disintegrating Afghan National Defense Security Forces, given these forces' present unacceptable level of fatalities and overstretch, and the Taliban's success in expanding their territorial acquisition. In the event of this eventuating, the Taliban takeover of power and diversion of the country to what they have called Emirates of Afghanistan, with a theocratic system of governance and abolition of all constitutional and other trappings that have characterized the evolution of the current system, will become very certain. And of course, Sheikh Saleh has already informed us about this. However, it would still be very difficult and arduous task for the Taliban to impose their writ across the country. Localized or regionalized deterrent forces are already consolidating to resist, and consequently, a renewed regional involvement in support of preferred forces cannot be ruled out, as was the case during the Taliban's previous rule. It is important to bear in mind that the Afghanistan conflict has been deeply entangled with many regional and extra-regional problems, ranging from the Indo-Pakistan dispute, Pakistan-Saudi close relations, China-Pakistan strategic ties, Saudi-Iranian rivalry, Iranian-Pakistani distrust, as well as US-Russian and US-China contentions. The third option is a negotiated political settlement for a power-sharing governance. Although the prevailing situation does not inspire much confidence in achieving a viable and lasting political settlement, if it does eventuate, it will provide an opportunity for a requisite and fundamental revision of the current governmental system. This will, of course, be contingent upon whether or not the settlement will have the support of, as I pointed out earlier, cross-section of Afghanistan's population, and also has the support of a regional consensus. Moreover, will the US and its allies find it ethical to continue their aid to an Afghan government in which the Taliban will have a central role, irrespective of their close links to Al-Qaeda? The government that will come into existence will need to be transitional for no more than a period of 2 years to make the necessary constitutional changes acceptable to all stakeholders and the power structures, leading to a general election under strong international supervision in order to generate a publicly mandated government. A transition in this direction will be by no means easy, but it may provide an opportunity to move from the current strong presidential system that has not served Afghanistan well to a two-level centralized and decentralized setup. And of course, that will go against what has been mentioned about the vision of the Taliban. In this structure, while the central representative government will be in charge of national finances, security, and foreign relations, the provinces or regions, or perhaps a combination of the combination of several provinces, with their own elected authorities, will have a sufficient autonomy in running their jurisdictions in consultation and cooperation with the central government. The system may be a kind of federalism. In the past, there has been considerable opposition to such a structure in Afghanistan, based on an argument that given the conditions of the country, it could easily result in the pulverization of politics and power and disintegration of the country. This argument does not hold true any longer. Despite all its internal and external problems, Afghanistan has undergone a considerable amount of change at the central and micro-society levels. A larger than ever younger generation of educated and well-connected Afghans with unprecedented political and social awareness has spanned the country. Although there has been a degree of brain drain from the country over the years, which is lately accelerated due to fear for the future, there is still a critical mass of this younger generation whose energies can be harnessed to build a stable and secure Afghanistan under suitable conditions. At this stage, it is hard to be optimistic about the chances of a settlement, as it may be perhaps too late. This is not to say, however, that urgent efforts should not be made by Afghan leaders within a framework of national unity and salvation, backed by the international community to persuade the Taliban and their Pakistani sponsors to compromise in support of saving Afghanistan from more disaster. It is very disappointing to see that the leaders in Kabul are still divided and bickering over the formation of a state Supreme Council with the necessary executive power to make collective decisions about how to stymie the tide of the Taliban advances and give some certainty to the Afghan people about their future. The sooner such a council is set up and becomes operational, the better. The current situation has already instilled panic and fear among citizens within a pervasive environment of violence and insecurity, causing an outflow of much needed human beings and capital. Most people have reason to feel that they are caught between self-centered, self-concerned leaders in Kabul and the real prospects for a return of the Taliban to power, with a threat of reimposing their discriminatory and brutal theocratic order, thus limiting the rights not only of women, but all citizens in general to a dignified and progressive living. Yet, the only political settlement that might have a chance of success is one within a paradigm of interlinking or interlocking national, regional, and international consensus, and enforceable by the UN Security Council. Failure to reach such a political resolution of the crisis should weigh heavily on Afghanistan's leaders, and that includes the Taliban leaders, and the United States and its allies, for they bear an acute responsibility for the mess that is Afghanistan today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amin. I think the many important points you've made, we'll come back to those in the discussion. And I know you're past midnight at your end, but if you could stay with us, that'd be absolutely wonderful. I think the emphasis on the fact that the nature of the government will inevitably reflect the way the war ends is a very important lesson. I hope that you are not as accurate in your pessimistic about being pessimistic about the negotiated settlement. Maybe it is not yet too late, but we will see in the discussion. Many of the issues you've raised have, in fact, been addressed in a slightly different format over the last 2 days, but they are all important issues we'll come back to later on. So thank you very much for your input. And we'll now move on to our next paper. Our next paper will be presented by Dr. Suzanne Schmidl, also based in Australia at the University of New South Wales. This paper is co-authored with an old friend of mine, Asri Sukri, from the CMI, or the Christian Michelin Institute in Bergen, but will be presented by Suzanne. Suzanne is an honorary academic at the University of New South Wales and an associated researcher with Swiss Peace. She sits on the boards of Pacifica and the Research for Development Impact Network, and holds many editorial positions in various journals, including the prominent one, Development in Practice. She's known for her transdisciplinary work and her ability to move between one discipline and the other. And I think, with my estimate, she's worked in Afghanistan for more than 2 decades, and has specialized particularly in trying to understand the drivers of conflict, and looked into issue of inclusivity and formation of peace, as well as conflict-sensitive practices within the country. In her paper, Suzanne will be exploring with us a slightly different take on what she calls a sort of 2 kinds of peace-building strategies. The macro level and the micro level both have been experimented with in Afghanistan, and Suzanne will share with us her insights on this. Again, Suzanne, if you please join us now. It would be great if you could just give the highlights of your paper in 10 minutes or so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Barakat and everybody else for having us here. And again, I'm sending the regrets of Dr. Asri Sukri. I have very big shoes to fill as we co-develop this paper, and hers was the macro strategy, and I'm working on the micro strategy. In many ways, this paper answers a question that was posed by Professor Saikal, or tries to answer a question, which is, will aid continue to Afghanistan even if the Taliban is part of a new political order? And that is partially what we are trying to think through in this particular presentation. I'd like to also quickly, just in the beginning, as Meredith did yesterday, acknowledge what we do sometimes in Australia, that Australia itself is still reckoning with its past and is basically reconciling with the Indigenous Australians about the land that we are on, which is stolen. And in that is just to acknowledge that the path to peace tends to be a long one and often a complicated and a winded path, but that many countries are in that path together. And I think we're all still, to some degree, learning together. So basically, let's see now whether I can move this. Okay, here we go. So basically, it is the question, you know, we know there is a new political order being negotiated. And the question that we are trying to look at is, should aid continue? And many donors are asking that. And our answer to that question basically would be that if we are to learn from the past of anything in Afghanistan, it is that an engagement with Afghanistan would be important. And I think that emphasis has been made by various speakers already, that, and President Ghani also made that emphasis quite strongly, that there's still a long way to go for Afghanistan to become into its role in the region. And for that, that engagement and partnership with outside countries should continue over time in order to make Afghanistan the leader, overcome poverty, move towards the SDGs, and also become a peaceful and prosperity country. So I won't dwell too much on it because basically it has been covered. Now there's two ways donors could go about it. And basically one way was during the 1990s when donors had a fairly principled engagement with Afghanistan. And it was largely in the nature of humanitarian action. And I witnessed that myself when I visited Afghanistan for the first time in 2000. And we observed a gap at the time that by a principled engagement, there was a lack of assistance in certain areas to help Afghanistan move forward, and certainly also engage with the Taliban when they were being in power. And that certainly more than humanitarian assistance is needed to have this engagement. So the second way would be then the alternative is what we have as constructive engagement. And that is certainly something that Chester Crocker first argued in the case of South Africa during the Reagan period. And the argument was that if there's only selective engagement with then apartheid South Africa, they basically would just continue to be entrenched and isolated rather than maybe become engagement partners. So his argument would be that instead of a principled or restricted engagement, that we should have a constructive engagement where we basically continue to work with the new political order and continue to work on development and humanitarian assistance to take Afghanistan forward. Now, clearly that question might be answered differently by different donors, but the argument would be why stop and why stop now, and whether or not we've learned from what we've done in the 90s. So again, I won't dwell too much about it, and we hope to expand on this in our paper. And now this, of course, comes to the micro level, because a lot of people here have talked about the macro level on the negotiated settlement is forthcoming, the new order. And the reason why I'm talking about the micro level, that was actually started my thinking, not just my own work in Afghanistan over the past years, particularly at the grassroots level with local organizations, but also a conversation I had with Mutawakil, the former foreign minister of the Taliban, before I left a few years back. And that question he posed to me, and he posed it to me as a German. He said, how did Germany came out of peace? And I've been thinking about that question for a fairly long time. We all know that protracted conflict creates a lot of trauma, intergenerational. It blurs the lines between who are victims and perpetrators. It has intensified inter and intergroup tensions. It has complicated other lower level conflicts at the community level, family, of a racist ideology. And basically, our argument is that in addition to what happens at the macro level, in addition to whatever negotiated political settlement, the outcome at a higher level or the central level that Saleh Saib talked about, we need to also think of the micro level, the local level, and how we can further peace building at that level. And obviously at that level, a lot of non-governmental organizations have been working for years with local communities to look at what could potentially be done to address all these issues that come with protracted conflict, because often trauma and lower level conflicts create a barrier for essentially a country to move out of war. And Mutawakil himself at that time noted that he felt that almost a district by district, if not even a smaller level of approach, needed to happen in Afghanistan to resolve the very unique problems that were created through protracted conflict in the different areas, and work with community mechanisms to move these forward. And again, none of what I'm sharing here is prescriptive. These are just first some of the thoughts that have come from my own research, but also largely in consultation with grassroots organization in Afghanistan. And that is the argument that both social as political peace building needs to continue. So political peace building does deal on the conflict at a political level, and social peace building deals more at, I think we've talked about the resilience of Afghanistan. It talks about the social fabric that has been damaged. I think there's been a lot of mention in that in more, and works with communities to rebuild some of the trust that has been broken, to deal with some of the past, crimes that were committed, but really collaborate with local actors, and particularly with customer and religious authorities on the ground to help settle the conflict, really in a context-specific way in Afghanistan. And at the same time, also work on building very context-specific trauma healing, which is often not talked too much about, how intergenerational trauma can create violent behavior long-term and make us resist against non-violent solutions. And in my time in Afghanistan, I've met many of these localized mechanisms, customary mechanisms that work on restorative rather than punitive justice, that very much work on restoring, working together. And I do believe that we need to explore how many of them are still functioning, to what degree some of them can be utilized for social peace building and helping communities. Very, very practical to look at conflict resolution of lower level conflict, to develop trauma support mechanisms, to also look at the locally grounded reintegration of ex-combatants. Conflict there's a lot of different armed groups. A lot of people have been fighting. They need to find a pathway back into their communities if Afghanistan is to get out of the cycle of violence. We also need to deal with internally displaced and also returning refugees, displaced people, or how having moved between rural and urban areas. And there's a lot more of this moving happening right now as territory is changing hands. And that also needs to be sorted in the fact that we do not see a lot of these revenge potentially killings as people feeling that the vacuum is created. And Afghanistan history has shown that these things all can happen. So there's a feeling that we need to actually think about these and put these structures and support these structures in place, and try to somehow fill the gap between the micro and the macro level in the peace building. And that needs to be supported in addition to humanitarian and development aid to continue in Afghanistan, because otherwise it is a question, are we now to turn our back on Afghanistan? Ashraf Ghani clearly was asking not to. And our argument would be, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at this stage if we were to do that as international aid community. So we, in our opinion, need to think about that. And that's something you asked me just to emphasize a few of the things that we are working on our, trying to work out in our joint papers. So basically the answer for a very constructive engagement, and particularly an engagement that marries traditional aid with very constructive engagement at the local level and subnational level. So I'm willing to answer some questions later, and I hope I didn't do too much of a big brush, but in the interest of time, I thought I'll just give you the highlights.
Thank you very much, Susan. I think, again, very important and valuable insights. And I really appreciate this elaboration of the micro and macro level of intervention. And I think you probably reached the right conclusion, saying that people of Afghanistan need people to stand by them regardless of who comes into Afghanistan. I think the point you make about being careful not to go back to humanitarian mood only, because that could exasperate things, is an important issue to take into our discussion. We'll come back in the time for question and answer. And thank you very much. And we'll press quickly into our next speaker, is another old friend who is known between us as maybe Mr. Taliban. He is Dr. Antonio Gustosi, is a visiting professor at King's College London, and he holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has, Antonio writes a lot, and he has many, many books, but I'm only going to mention the ones that are directly related to Afghanistan, that have been really instrumental in giving us an in-depth understanding of the context of Afghanistan, and in particular the armed groups and how it operates. His paper on war, politics and society, his book, War, Politics and Society in Afghanistan between 1978 and 1992, was published by Georgetown University. The book that always comes to mind is the Quran, Kalashnikov and Laptop, and the Neo-Taliban Insurgency between 2002, 2007, and that was published by Columbia. And of course, the Empires of Mud, War and Warlords in Afghanistan, as well as Policing Afghanistan, both were published by Columbia University. Now, no one knows how Antonio finds the time to write all these books, but he does. And we're very, very privileged to have him share with us his insights today. He's obviously, like everyone else, will be contributing a longer paper, and is given only 10 minutes to summarize the key points of his paper with us. Antonio, over to you.
Thank you very much. And as you said, I only have 10 minutes, so I will only focus on a few points. The paper is much longer than that. So my main 2 points are what the Taliban want out of the talks that are going on in Doha, 1, and 2, whether the Taliban have changed or not, and how they've changed. Let's start straight away with the first point. What the Taliban want, I will be very explicit. The Taliban aim for what actually they say in public recently, an Islamic government, which means a government, not the emirate, but the government based on Islamic law, which means not a secular type of government. And in practice, this means that they're aiming for a coalition between the Taliban and a number of parties, groups, personalities. Essentially, I would say, to simplify a little bit, the all Mujahideen parties or part thereof. There are also other groups, because of course the situation, the political landscape in Afghanistan has complicated a lot over the last 20 years with the all Mujahideen parties fragmenting into multiple factions. There are 7 factions of Jamiat, 3 at least factions of Islami, and we can keep counting. So things have been more complicated than that. And of course, there are new Islamic groups, Salafis, etc., and other groups that are not strictly speaking Islamic parties, but might well accept the principle of Islamic government, if only for pragmatic reasons. So this doesn't rule out that other groups and parties might still exist, but essentially the Taliban, when they think about the first post peace, post-war government, they are aiming for a coalition, ideally led by themselves, formed with this type of parties. And they've been working actively at this, having meetings. In fact, in some cases, they already have agreement with some of these parties, but it's still work in progress. So essentially, of course, this is a scheme that leaves out secularist groups and parties, liberal parties, if there are any in Afghanistan, not that many, leftist parties, and so on and so forth. Simply leaves them out of the post-war government. So that the first bit was relatively easy. More complicated to discuss whether the Taliban have changed or not. Here we have to discuss a number of points in detail, or some detail. I would say that simply there is change. Whether that's the change that others would like to see or not is a different matter. But simply the Taliban have changed in a number of ways. First of all, the Taliban now no longer have an autocratic leadership. Of course, during the emirate, there was one man leading, and he was taking all the decisions, all the important decisions, and he was not very open to discussing matters with his fellow Taliban leaders. Right now, we don't really have a strong leader within the Taliban. In fact, I would say there hasn't been an autocratic leader of the Taliban after the fall of the emirate. Mullah Omar, when he was still alive, didn't play that role. It was not leading in any meaningful style the Taliban. Mullah Baradar was not the type of autocratic leader, was more leading by consensus. And his successors have also done the same. Akhtar Mohammad Mansour at one point tried to impose, if you like, his leadership after he announced the death of Mullah Omar and tried to get and succeeded in getting selected as his successor. His idea was, well, now that I'm, formally the leader, not just, the deputy of a dead man, I want to have the same powers that he had. I want to rule the Taliban essentially I wouldn't say that, of course, but in an autocratic way. I will decide everything. And especially I decide about, this negotiation. I decide about appointments. I decide about the the policy lines of the Taliban. Of course, he almost destroyed the Taliban trying to do that. There was a massive revolt of the perhaps half of the members of the leadership council of the Taliban. The Taliban barely survived. Of course, there was a split, which was very threatening for a few months. Then it was partially reabsorbed and ended up with the Rasul Shura, which then didn't do very well and entered a period of decline, and today has almost disappeared. But in the summer of 2015, it looked like the Taliban were about to disintegrate. So the message which Mansour had to accept, but also his deputy at the time, Abatullah, also understood very well, is the Taliban cannot any longer be ruled in an autocratic way. The Taliban have expanded dramatically. They have incorporated or co-opted new constituencies, tribal constituencies, political constituencies. They're bigger and are essentially, for a number of cultural and political reasons, they can only be run in a collegial way. So my argument is that after 2001, the Taliban have been run essentially collegially, and the leader is essentially primus inter pares, and is not an absolute leader. That is important. I think it's good for the Taliban. I'm not sure it is good for anybody else, but it's good for the Taliban because it's simply collegial leadership is a more effective way of running an organization than autocracy. An autocrat might be very right sometimes and very wrong other times. A collegial leadership might not have the kind of, touch of genius that sometimes makes autocrats popular, but at the same time is also unlikely to make terrible mistakes as autocrats sooner or later do. And I think we see, the Taliban out there have been rather carefully, it's not very quickly, crafting quite a smart strategy to get back to power. I think, from the point of view, I would commend them. It was not very quick, but it was quite effective as a way of developing their own policies. There are other changes, though. It's not only about collegial leadership. I think the Taliban, at least the current leadership of the Taliban, the Abatullah and the circle, accept that the emirate is not coming back. So when they speak about Islamic government, they mean a coalition which will be building a state which will be hybrid between the Emirate and the Islamic Republic, which they do consider, of course, to be an Islamic government. So, and as I mentioned before, that means a coalition with other groups. And I think they are sincere about this, not because, they become more democratic per se, but because they are more experienced. They also understand more the regional environment. They understand that none of the regional powers, not even Pakistan, certainly not Iran, not Russia, not China, India, of course, is not a country with which they relate, want the Emirate back. They want a coalition. They want, especially Iran and Russia, they want their allies, their clients, friends in Afghanistan to be brought into the future government. They might even accept the Taliban leadership, but they want the interest to be protected by their allies. And you can call them proxies, allies, clients, but anyway, the point is they want this party, these personalities to be there, to be represented, to play an important role. And I think the Taliban accept that they can't run Afghanistan on their own. As a landlocked country, they need, of course, without even Pakistan, it would be completely impossible. But even if they manage to get Pakistan on board, without Russia and the Central Asia and without Iran, having the Afghan economy recover would be impossible. So, they need that. I think the leadership understand that. Of course, if you speak to Taliban commanders, to some military leaders, they still think they're going to get the Emirate. But the leadership, the political leadership, which are the ones, that some more understanding how the world works, they see the necessity of having some kind of coalition. Now, of course, coalition can mean many things. It can mean you're a partner, you are the leading partner, you are the dominant partner. And I think the Taliban aim for being at least a leading partner. So they're not happy to be, one of many. They want to be the leading partner. If they can even be the dominant partner, that would be even better. Now, that's about the state. Of course, the judiciary is battle also the Taliban. They believe that it's one of their main selling points, especially for the rural population. In fact, over the last 20 years, they've been experimenting a little bit with the judiciary, with multiple reforms. But, the general line of evolution has been that from being exclusively reliance on Sharia court, they've been accepting more and more to integrate the courts with customary justice. So in many areas, you can see that the Taliban have been working with the elders, letting the elders sort out most of the issues and only dealing with the issue the elders could not deal with, which was not the case originally. On elections, the Taliban don't have an official policy on that, but in the paper I discussed this at length, talking to Taliban members at various levels of the structure, what comes out clearly, I think, is that they've been discussing, if not formally about this, there are different views, and that the majority of the Taliban seem to accept that some kind of competitive system will be allowable, that is compatible with Islam, with Islamic law, and some of them even say might be good. Doesn't mean that there will be entirely open elections. I think probably they're still, discussing among themselves, but I think they would have said something like a system similar to Iran, where you would have some kind of vetting about who can participate, usually typically on the basis of, whether they accept, not of course, Velayat Faqih, but, in this case, it would be accepting the principle of Islamic law being at the center of a government, maybe looking at the political past of individuals, whatever, but this is still, quite vague. But basically, they said that some kind of selection system for the leadership is a good way of running a country. On women's rights, there have been a lot of discussions. Of course, the Taliban always said, that their clamp down on women's rights during the Emirate was a temporary measure. What we've seen in recent years, at least over the last 10 years or so, is that there's been some softening of the policies. They've been allowing girls to attend school on certain conditions up to a certain point. Of course, they've been trying to change the curriculum being taught in the schools. Of course, they want to elect the teachers. They don't want male teachers to teach girls, etc., etc. But compared to the Emirate, there is some softening there, which I think will have to, the details of what would be in the future will have to be negotiated. On governance, again, there is more inclination in recent years to accommodate, to seek accommodation with elders at the village and also the tribal level in many cases. And
ask you to try and conclude, please. Sorry.
And this is the last point. And in general, what we've seen is quite high degree of pragmatism of the leadership in their even understanding relation. In particular, I only mention one point, is the very friendly relation they established from around 2015, 16 with Russia. For the Taliban to have this kind of relation with Russia was very controversial originally. It originated very strong debates at the leadership level and also below that, but they've done it. So for them to have this kind of relation with Russia is certainly a strong sign of pragmatism, and that's why I think that this issue of global jihadism would be addressed by the Taliban. It's not the interest, merely for pragmatic reasons, to maintain the relationship with global jihad. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, again, very insightful analysis of the changes within the Taliban. I'm sure as we go into the question and answer session, there'll be further opportunity to maybe unpack some of these issues, particularly with Sheikh Saleh with us on the panel. Maybe he can give us some reflection on some of those issues later on. I highlight in particular the turn from an autocratic to a collegial leadership and the turning point of 2015, the aspiration for a hybrid form of government that goes between the Emirate and the Islamic Republic, but not necessarily recreating the Emirate, and the openness for a form of competition to election of leader, and not necessarily, leaders are just born into those positions. And of course, the question of judiciary and the Sharia law and its potential mix with customary law. I think that's particularly important. We'll come back to some of those issues in the discussion, Antonio. Thank you very much. Our last but not least presenter today in this panel is Dr. Dipali Mokapodehaya. I'm not sure if I said the name rightly, you can correct me later, Dipali. But Dipali is an associate professor in global policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And prior to joining the Humphrey School, she was a faculty member at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs from 2012 to 2020. In 2016, she was a visiting scholar at New York's Center on International Cooperation, and her research focuses on the relationship between political violence, state building, and governance during and after war. She's currently also serving as senior expert on Afghanistan for the United States Institute of Peace, and she has authored many articles and books. And the one I'd like to highlight is her book, Warlords, Strongman Governors, and State Building in Afghanistan, published by Cambridge Press in 2014. And of course, she's also, she's very active on the policy front and has contributed many policy briefs to USIP and Carnegie Endowment over the years. So I turn over to you, Dipali, to share with us your insights. Again, if you could just please keep it to 10 minutes, would be most grateful.
Thank you so much, Professor Barakat. It's wonderful to be here and to see everyone. I think my comments will build actually on those of my colleagues in a number of ways. The title of our panel referred to an end state and post-conflict governance, but I think all of our remarks reflect, at least in part, a refutation of the notion that we're approaching anything post-conflict, let alone an end in that sense. Instead, what I want to argue today is that Afghanistan is entering a new chapter in its nation building project, one that in many ways was suspended actually for the past 20 years. I think that chapter is likely to involve what the political sociologist Charles Tilly called war making as state making, whereby the conversation between a range of key social actors will continue through violence, but also through new forms of contentious politics. And the conversants will be asking and answering some big, long-standing questions about what the Afghan nation is and how it should organize and govern itself. The past 20 years, even though we often speak about it this way, have only been in part about the project of building an Afghan state. More importantly, they have been about a quest on the part of the United States and its allies to avenge the attacks on September 11th and to stamp out the network that perpetrated them. So in that sense, state building has been a means toward an end rather than an end in and of itself. And state building in the service of countering extremism, which now we have seen in other parts of the world since 2001, is really about creating regimes that will be loyal and dependent on outsiders. And after 2001, in the Afghan case, those outsiders, not unlike the British Empire in the 19th century, were looking for a reliable leader in Kabul that would rent its territory to them in the service of their own national security ends. But unlike in the 19th century, in the 21st century, that regime has also been expected to hold elections, to protect human rights, and institutionalize the rule of law, even as it has been deliberately and meaningfully limited in its control over politics, over violence, over capital. So in a sense, then, only now, as the last American troops depart, can the Afghan state glimpse the opportunity to establish anything resembling sovereignty over its own internal and foreign affairs. Of course, that's not to say that outsiders no longer have a role. On the contrary, security forces remain reliant on American support, and a number of civilian institutions that are expected to deliver key public goods and services across the country are very much donor dependent as well. And, on the less constructive side, neighbors continue to meddle. And even when we speak of intra-Afghan negotiations, we all know that it's the foreign policies and practices in the region and beyond the region that will be key to any lasting peace. But still, I think there's no question that a new moment is upon Afghan state-society relations as foreign influences recede. And the main axis of the conflict, which we've been speaking about in this panel between the Republic and the Taliban, is the most obvious axis, given the profoundly distinct visions of government each represents. But having just got back from Kabul last week for the first time visit in a year, I wanted to share some thoughts on some of the elements of the larger conversation that strike me as also really important, even as they often remain out of view because this glaring existential struggle exists between the government and the insurgency. And the first is one that Professor Saikal's comments touched on, of institutional design and the management of center-periphery relations. So there has always been a long simmering debate about the acutely centralized nature of the Afghan state, but I think that debate has taken on a different urgency of late. The current constitution, as we all know, enables an enormous degree of concentration of power in Kabul. But I have always argued that institutionalized centralization need not necessarily be analogous to micromanagement or to a politics of exclusion. It wasn't always that way. But in the last few years, appointments and budgets, policies and programs have been managed by a remarkably small clique in terms that reflect an acute kind of regime consolidation. And in that context, concepts like republicanism and reform risk becoming meaningless, even when those who work for the government on both the civilian and military side describe a kind of hollowing out from within. It shouldn't be surprising then, I think, that many defenders of the Republic as a system are asking whether the current constitutional order is worth saving. And that particular conversation reflects a noteworthy mixing of civil and what I think some might consider uncivil society in terms that confuse binaries like warlord versus Democrat or old guard versus new generation. I think instead we're seeing Mujahideen commanders and public intellectuals alike asking if the state's current design is the solution to the current conflict, or at least in part, some part of its cause. And in many ways, this is what state building is meant to be about, a domestic negotiation over how much power particular institutions should have and why. But in Afghanistan today, it is impossible to decouple that conversation about institutional design from the one about war fighting and the challenge of holding a country together that has always been marked by many different forms of identity and association. I think any visitor to Kabul will note right now it's impossible to miss the ever-rising salience of ethnicity and subnational regionalism in the political discourse. Appointments, military campaigns, the failure to prevent terror attacks in certain neighborhoods, the falling of particular districts to Taliban control, all are often interpreted through concerns about ethno-chauvinism and a kind of preferential politics that privileges certain citizens over others. And this framing fuels what I think is a very misguided notion that the Afghan nation is tenuous or that the Afghan people are somehow ungovernable, when in fact both nation and state have a long and quite resilient history in Kabul, but also across the provinces. But I think we're at a moment where myth can become reality, at least in the short term, if those with access to guns and money and foreign political patronage decide that the republic from which they have gained tremendously no longer represents them or is not committed to protecting and defending their constituents. And here I want to underscore again that categories that we outsiders have always elevated, technocrat versus commander, Islamist versus liberal, militant versus civic activist, I think these may actually prove far less relevant than one divide to which we haven't paid adequate attention. And that is the divide between those who will stay and those who will leave. I think more than any time since my first trip to Afghanistan in 2004, I sensed a growing resentment towards key decision makers when they are not paying the steepest costs, nor will they be the ones who will have to live with the consequences of the decisions they are making. I heard one description of citizenship as emotional attachment that I found very striking. The need for ministers to go home at night and talk to their children about what it's like for them to be growing up in the midst of this carnage. Notably, this is true on the leadership of both sides, the government and the Taliban. Both are in many ways very disconnected. And I think about the work of the 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun, who made so vivid in his writings on social solidarity that leadership during war is about sharing in the struggle and sharing in the suffering. And I think many folks rightly are focused on the activation of local militia. It's a space worthy of attention and concern, but the notion of what I heard described as mobilizing an indigenous Afghanistan should not be understood exclusively or even primarily in military terms. I think on the contrary, it read to me as a response to the ruling influence of the diaspora and their foreign supporters, an influence that has not delivered genuine democracy, nor lasting peace, nor meaningful prosperity to most, even as it has handsomely enriched and empowered a few. So I think as districts continue to fall and the body count rises in the ANDSF and among civilians, there is little doubt that the related concepts of citizenship and leadership will move to the forefront. And I think people will be asking, how should we be led, but also by whom? So in closing, I'll say, as the remaining American soldiers begin continue their withdrawal, I think there's an irony that arises that after years of being constrained from every direction, the Afghan state has now been pushed into a new kind of independence at a time when it's most vulnerable from within. President Ghani noted this point in his recent foreign affairs essay, and he echoed it this morning when he said, quote, "The withdrawal also represents an opportunity for the Afghan people to achieve real sovereignty," unquote. So for me, one question then that arises is, can the imperative for regime survival in Kabul actually overlap with that of state building? And can it make room for the society's ongoing work of defining and advancing the Afghan nation? I think so long as regime survivalism dominates, competing political elites will be further incentivized to conspire to their own ends, to double down on their parochial basis of support. And ordinary people will seek representation and protection where they can find it, even as they maintain membership in the larger Afghan national community. Meanwhile, for the Taliban, I think, as Antonio laid out, the population, the Taliban now must contend with a population whose majority, the so-called Nasl Jawan, or the young generation, has no living memory of life under the anachronistic, brutal regime of the mid-90s. And disruption through terror, the capture of territory, even rebel governance, these are very different than the political project of governing during peacetime. And the new Afghanistan, especially in its urban centers, it's not fertile ground for a simplistic radical governing ideology to take root. So there the question is, can the Taliban's war-making strategy transform into a conception of state-making that accommodates the kind of contentious politics that now mark Afghan civic life? If not, I think it will face political resistance of all kinds and militant resistance, even if it succeeds to capture territory in the short term. And finally, the means by which the United States and its allies frame their withdrawal in the next chapter also matter profoundly. Western powers have wrapped themselves in the cloaks of human rights, of procedural democracy and justice, but they have routinely privileged idiosyncratic, personalized, and predatory forms of politics when it has served their aims. I think it's an open question if the US government can shift to a model of partnership that affords the Afghan state a new kind of responsibility and respect as a sovereign member of the international community. Can it recognize and engage with the Afghan people as citizens in a rowdy, imperfect republic, in many ways not that different from my own, and respect them on those terms? These are the questions as a concerned scholar that I'm asking, looking on at this incredibly important moment, and I thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dipali. I hope you'll be able to answer some of those questions in the paper when you submit it finally, and we will make it available to all to go into more detail. Again, extremely insightful. And I think the point you've raised about people having started to leave is particularly interesting. And it does bring into question the whole oomph in policy now to try and capture the gains over the last 20 years. What will you capture if the intellectual section of the society, those concerned, are already moving out? And I do not want to add to anxiety, as Dr. Ashraf Ghani said before, but we've also heard reports about even foreign missions reducing the size of their embassies already in the capital. So very interesting, very insightful points. This has been absolutely fascinating panel, and we are, I'm afraid, left with only about 10 minutes for discussion. And I have a number of questions from the audience, so I'll start with the first one here. It comes from Dr. Barney Rubin, who says, what is a bigger threat to the gains that we've just been referring to of Afghanistan, a reactionary policies of a future government, or aid conditionality in the name of protecting those gains? And I would like to start, maybe Dr. Amin, if you would like to comment on this.
Well,
Yes.
the Afghanistan situation is so complex at the moment that I think it's very difficult to say that which one would be more productive in the case of this country. But I think while the current system has really failed the Afghan people, and the Afghan leaders have failed the Afghan people, I don't think that the Taliban are providing a viable alternative. And at the same time, I think the engagement of the international community has not been productive. I mean, with the current system has not been very productive. And of course, if the Taliban is a big player in the power structure in Afghanistan, or for that matter in Kabul, and then I don't think that many members of the international community would find it ethical to be very forthcoming in terms of providing the type of assistance to Afghanistan which could enable the coalition government, which has been talked about, could maintain itself and at the same time maintain the integrity of Afghanistan. I think that the point which was made that the number of people who already or the people have started leaving. I mean, I mentioned the flight of capital and people from Afghanistan. I mean, for foreign missions, it's true, absolutely true that they are also downsizing. But in the, for example, Australia has already closed down its embassy. In fact, it's taken the lead in closing down its embassy and also withdrawing its forces. In fact, most of its forces were withdrawn as well. And I would imagine that a number of smaller European countries will also follow that example. To me, it's really no. It's a question of. I mean, I agree with Antonio on the issue of that. The Taliban perhaps to some extent has changed and this and that. But at the same time, I think the fact is that on the one hand, the United States has been supporting the Afghan government and trying to uphold the sanctity of that government, as awful as that government is from inside, and as rotten it is from inside. On the other hand, have signed a peace deal with the Taliban, which have basically promoted the Taliban to the position of partners in peace with the United States. You cannot do both and then expect that everything will fall in place and things will be good. I mean, the Taliban have been fighting for the last 20, 21 years, and now they can see the trophy. The trophy is there for them, and they're not going to really stop. My bottom line is that the Afghan situation, the Afghan conflict, is more likely to be settled on a battlefield rather than through any form of negotiations or a long-term and viable political settlement.
Thank you very much. If I may move to Dr. Saleh. Dr. Saleh, from your reflection and analysis, do you believe the Taliban is sufficiently aware of the degree in which Afghanistan is dependent on international aid contributions? And do you think, like Antonio believes, there has been some small changes in the directions on a number of issues, including on women issues and so on, and that the Taliban would be willing to make more and more adjustments to accommodate what Amin and others say is probably fundamental for some of those donors. They cannot support country that goes against their fundamental principles.
زه په پیل کې د ټول ملګرو احساسات او احترام سره ګوري دلته څو خبرې دي. یو موضوع دا ده چې د تیر شل کاله چې کوم جنگ وشو دا د هغو ناانډولو توافقاتو نتیجه وه چې په پیل کې د بون په کنفرانس کې ترسره شول او بیا دغه ناانډولي
with the permission we have seen groups, we saw the groups that they were isolated and some groups were fortified. And I think that in terms of the system Taliban thinks and the negotiation that they have started, I think this is this is showing that they want a system in Afghanistan that could be Islamic and could be inclusive and could have all Afghans as well. So so an international community should look at the views of Afghans. Afghans by themselves want an Islamic system.
So this kind of system, we can say that the movement of Taliban, as now they have a hope to get there. And talking about the rights, we can say doubtlessly, as Taliban have earlier said, if it is about the women rights, they give all those rights to the woman that has been mentioned in Islam. If it is about work, about being a teacher, so if Taliban have the cooperation of the international community, they will provide all the rights considering the framework which exists. So we can say, if we pay attention to minority groups or other rights that were mentioned by friends, so we can say the Taliban have attention to them and they have sufficient attention to them. So I think that the Taliban take account of all of them and they have sufficient attention to all of them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does anyone else would like to come on to this issue before we move to the next question? Maybe Susan?
Yeah, just quickly, maybe to reiterate, I think part of the first part of the paper is the argument. I mean, obviously, none of these choices are very good, as has been argued, but is the argument whether we can, whether a principle in game, which I guess is aid conditionality, would actually be productive or not, and whether that would actually make a point. And I think here we need to go back to what Dipali so rightfully said is, are we able as international donors to step back and engage with a new order and allow the Afghans to sort out how that new order may look like, even if we don't like it, in well recognition that obviously our approach for the past 20 years hasn't really furthered anything either. So I think we probably need to just acknowledge the fact that so far it hasn't been going so well, and perhaps there is a space that we should give, and maybe I think have a responsibility to give to our, without doing it conditionality and giving that space for it to sort out. And that is never short term. Let's acknowledge that this short term thinking is why we are where we are in Afghanistan. So perhaps we just need to step back and ask our questions. Are we willing to think long term? Peace takes long term, state building takes time. And are we then willing to support that process without conditionality?
Thank you so much. And that leads us nicely to the next question, which basically asks whether the Taliban can be trusted or can maintain a ceasefire after the Americans and NATO has withdrawn. We have heard this again and again over the last couple of days, that the jihad is linked to the presence of an occupying force in the country. Now by 9/11, they would be out. In fact, yesterday we've heard from other colleagues that they're rushing even more, that big bases like Bagram and others have already been almost emptied or are emptied. Does the Taliban link directly the jihad to the continuation of violence, and will it cease violence the moment there are no occupiers forces in the country? Antonio.
Yeah, well, the Taliban, the messages they've been sending during the meeting, especially with Americans, is that there won't be a ceasefire until certain conditions that they pose are met. And there are essentially three conditions. In fact, there are more, but the important ones are three. One is that their prisoners, the remaining prisoners are released, then the Taliban leaders are delisted, and that there is another government in place to talk to, because they won't be essentially, they don't say that clearly, we won't talk to President Ghani, but the message is they won't talk to President Ghani. So at that point, if there was, say, an interim government or whatever is going to be called in place, then they would be ready, this is what we were saying weeks ago, to declare ceasefire. Now, the problem is that the more the government tries to resist them and the more it's unsuccessful at doing that, the more the Taliban position hardens. We've been seeing that over a period of 18 months. Originally the Taliban were saying, a year ago, our red line is we want a third of all positions in a power sharing government. Now, this some weeks ago, they said 50%, and now I think even 50% is probably less than would settle for. And the more they gain on the ground, the more demanding they will be. And I suspect that we are reaching the point where the interim government itself is dead, meaning that the Taliban won't settle for the interim government anymore because they think they're being quite successful in negotiating bilateral deals with leaders, parties, factions, groups on the Islamic Republic side. So they believe that they can, cherry pick their partners for the future, and that is enough. I think they will settle for that. With regard to trusting them, there are only two options. Either you trust or you keep fighting, if you're good at fighting. It seems to me right now, the Islamic Republic is not very good at fighting. So one has to make a realistic assessment. Can we fight effectively or not? Because if not, the more they try to do it and lose, the less they get at the end in terms of a settlement. That has to be an assessment everybody's got to make, because fighting for the purpose of losing is not a good idea anyway. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dipali, I don't know if you were with us yesterday, but we had the opening speech yesterday by Ambassador Mutlaq Qahtani from Qatar, who talked about some of the complexities of the peace process or of the negotiation that's going on in Doha. And he emphasized that it's all about power. It's all about power, and there are a lot of items that are being pushed on the agenda that are doing nothing but distracting the two sides from focusing on power. And now we hear from Antonio that obviously the Taliban does not want to speak to the Ghani government, but in effect, they are in Doha at the moment. They are speaking to his direct representatives as part of a larger coalition of sides coming representing the Republic idea. How do you see it from your perspective, Dipali, in terms of the future of power sharing? To what extent do you think the two could coexist in a transitional government, or in a, maybe as Antonio suggested, maybe past the transition base and move directly into a long-term government?
I mean, I think, Professor Barakat, this is the central question, right? Of whether or not we are talking about a moment in which the sharing of power can be negotiated. Historically, in Afghanistan, I mean, in my own work, I made an argument that that kind of accommodation is endemic to Afghan politics, is part of why the Afghan nation has survived as long as it has, why the state has survived despite enormous assaults from the outside and interference and limitations imposed from the outside for so long. But I think my concern is that this is not a moment where power sharing is really in the minds of either the Ghani government or the Taliban leadership. In fact, for them, the moment appears to be about consolidation, right? And about maximizing in the short term as much power as they can have. And I think that is not compatible, in my mind, with a project of state building. That is a mindset which is about either, on the one hand, regime survival, and on the other hand, winning a war. And I think if there's a role for outsiders, if there's a role for the United Nations and Security Council members, if there's a role for the United States and its Western partners and for countries in the region, is to figure out how to incentivize the key decision makers on both sides to imagine accommodation, both internally and between themselves, as absolutely of the essence in this moment. Because in the long term, I don't think either the regime or the Taliban will be able to survive or thrive with this kind of strategy. But at the moment, it's asking each of them to think about the medium to long term in terms that I don't think we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you so much. We're running out of time, but there's many questions coming as we speak. I think your discussion has triggered people's imagination. There is a question maybe is best addressed first to Dr. Saleh, and then others also can maybe contribute to it. And that it's linked, if I may, I will rephrase it a little bit because it's linked to something that was raised yesterday as well about the capacity of the Taliban, about the prudent capacity of the Taliban to engage in politics. You know, somebody yesterday questioned whether they would ever be able to engage this level of academia and so on. And as you know, we have got a lot of accusations saying we're trying to pass you on as an academic, come Taliban, etc. But the question is this: can the mediator or the mediators, the communities that is trying to see Afghanistan out of this situation, can they offer anything to the Taliban to help guide, supervise, build a capacity so that there is a greater analytical engagement that goes into the detail of some of that policy? We mentioned yesterday the document that was published by Mullah Brother over the weekend, or the message. And in fact, over the last couple of years, there's been a number of messages, from the one that stated a total amnesty to those who do not carry guns against the Taliban after the withdrawal, all the way to this weekend that has maybe been the closest in terms of suggesting what the future could look like. But there has not been anything detailed. And the anxiety that the president referred to earlier, that people hear things going on, Dipali mentioned it also, it's partly because people don't know the details. It's the details that worries the individual, and about, you know, the future of their family, their economics, their livelihood, etc. Could the mediating society around you, around this situation now, provide anything to help?
پرته له شکه وسیط یا سهولتکار هیوادونه په هر ځای کې په هر قضیه کې غټ رول لري.
Undoubtedly, mediators can play a vital role in
as the negotiations are going on in Qatar, so we can say the state of Qatar can play very important role, and also it has played very important role. At the same time, the other countries that in the case of Afghanistan, they have played roles. So we can say they have played very important role, and we need such a role to be played. And also we can say most of the cases that now exist, this is very important that we pay attention to such kind of things. And if we do not have steps that are taken in
وسیط په دې اړه باندې یا سهولتکار یا افغانستان په قضیه کې هغه دي په دې اړه ډېر څه کولای شي که دوی په دې اړه خپل جديت ښکاره کړي او وکړي.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saleh. I fear we may have lost some in the translation, and I do apologize for that. We keep on getting the translation on and off. Those of you who speak Pashto are fortunate. You could have followed the discussion. But thank you very much for the contribution. I must bring this to an end. We're already 10 minutes into the next session. But a big thank you to all our panelists. Very, very appreciated the time you spent with us, in particular those who are having to stay beyond midnight to join us. We will, as I said at the beginning, inshallah, be publishing the full papers, and then there'll be a greater opportunity to engage with the various point of views. I would like now to announce that we will have a short break, no longer than 5 minutes, and then come back to our panel 4, which will be led by my friend Sayed Madani from Kabul, who will join us as the moderator. Thank you very much to all of you, and hope that you will continue with us in 5 minutes.